Okay, so thank you very much. I will present you a part of my doctoral research about right-wing populism and the notion of democracy. So first of all, a significant part of the literature considers that right-wing populist parties are undemocratic, and according to some authors, these parties are opposed to democratic institutions, or according to others, they are opposed to the value of democracy. In the other hand, in the political field, right-wing populist parties consider themselves to be democratic parties. They present themselves as the defender of the people, the promoters of a true democracy against, for example, the European Union, against other political parties, against immigration, or against Islam. So I therefore ask the following questions. First of all, how does right-wing populism define democracy? And maybe a second question, why does right-wing populism mobilize the term democracy in its speeches? So to answer these questions, I propose to study the ideological production of two political parties. The first one is the Rassemblement National in France and the Freiheitliche Partei Österreich in Austria. So the Rassemblement National and the FPÖ are two parties historically classified on the far right, and they are also referred as right-wing populist parties. So both parties have also transformed or modernized their speeches with the presidency of Marine Le Pen and with the presidency of Heinz Christian Strache. So from an electoral point of view, both parties have important electoral results and sits in many institutions, and the FPÖ has been present in the Kurz government. So in addition, both parties, so Rassemblement National and the FPÖ, have private and professional relationship, for example, inside the Europe of Nations and Freedom group. So in relation to my research question, I decided to study all the ideological production of the Rassemblement National and the FPÖ. It could, we could say press release, for example, speeches, press conference, open letters, draft law, etc. So my data collection is carried out on the party's website from 1st January 2015 to 31 December 2018. So this choice seems relevant to me for several reasons. First of all, these documents are approved by members of the party and publicly validated. Secondly, these documents allow me to compare different types of production and also to varying content, sources, audience, time period, and also have an overview of the party ideology. So finally, for my data analysis, I proceed in a 3 steps analysis with 3 questions. First of all, the first one is, does right-wing populism mobilize the term democracy? It's more a lexicometric analysis. How does right-wing populism define democracy? It's a semantic analysis. And the last one, why does right-wing populism mobilize the notion of democracy? And it's more a social ideological analysis. So first one, the Rassemblement National in France. Of all documents published on the Rassemblement National website between early 2015 and late 2018, the lemma democracy appears 682 times in 350 documents, and the number of occurrences varies with time. So the term democracy is more commonly used during election periods, and the number of occurrences varies also according to the type of document. So the term democracy is more commonly used in documents intended for a wide audience, for example, speech and press conference. I could therefore observe a kind of controlled use of the term democracy in the Rassemblement National discourses. Same for the FPE. Of all documents published on the FPE website between 2015 and 2018, the lemma, so lemma democracy, democratic, and democratic, appears 569 times in 311 documents, and the number of occurrences varies with time. So the notion of democracy is also more commonly used during election period, for example, during the presidential campaign and during the elections in Vienna. So small distinction, the party's communication is different from that of the Rassemblement National. Single documents can include a speech, an analysis, and sometimes a press release also, so there is therefore a difficulty in classifying by types of document, as I did for the Rassemblement National. So now the semantic analysis. So in the rhetoric of the Rassemblement National, democracy is linked to 8 frames that I have identified by induction. So these frames vary in intensity of use. Maybe the first one is proximity. Proximity links democracy to local actors and institutions. Control and transparency frame means that a citizen must know what the deputies are doing. Representation and general interest frame, freedom of expression and debate also. The rule of law, focus more attention on respect for individual freedoms and the separation of power, but also on neutral justice. And the self-determination frame, also a political regime frame, considers that democracy is a way of organizing the states. And the last one, enlargement to the greatest number, it's only mobilized with the notion of democratization, so it's maybe a special frame. So from a quantitative point of view, we could say that the party links the notion of democracy mainly to popular sovereignty, to the necessity to represent the French people and the general interest, and to the guarantee of a free debate between the different political parties. But we also observe a variation according to personalities and documents. So this is just small example, but not all the members of the Rassemblement National mobilize the same frame. So one example, Wallerand Saint-Just is, for example, a regional deputy, and he used the proximity frame. On the other hand, Nicolas Bay is a representative in the European Parliament, and he doesn't use this proximity frame. So Nicolas Bay used more the control and transparency and rule of law frame, and Wallerand Saint-Just not. So frames change also according to mandate. Another variation, frames change according to the type of documents. So the proximity and representation general interest frames are not used in all documents. For example, proximity is not highlighted in intervention in political institution. In addition, at press conferences, democracy is defined through the frame of freedom of expression and debate. And moreover, in the speeches, I observe a significant mobilization of the self-determination and election frame, thus creating a link between the speakers and his audience. So this various observation highlights a kind of controlled and strategic use of the notion of democracy in the Rassemblement National speeches. In the rhetoric of the FPE, democracy, the term democracy is also linked to 8 frame that I've also identified by induction, and these frames also vary in intensity of use. So if we compare the frames with the Rassemblement National, we find similarities, for example, freedom of expression, representation and general interest, rule of law, control and transparency. But on the other hand, unlike the Rassemblement National, the FPE splits self-determination and election. So according to the FPE, self-determination refers to a part of the discourse on promoting a more direct democracy, like in Switzerland, for example, and the the term direct democracy is not very present either in the Rassemblement National discourse, so it's kind of distinction between Rassemblement National and FPE. In addition to that, the FPE also does not use a proximity frame, but use a societal values frame, which is absent from the rhetoric of the Rassemblement National. So democracy will be a value, a social value that unites the community and Austrians. We also observe a variation in the frames according to political figures. So candidates for election favors the frame self-determination and the question of direct democracy, but also the frame election. So these frames bind the politician who mobilize them to his electorate, and he established a bridge between the politician and his potential voters. So, as with the Rassemblement National, I observe a kind of strategic use of the notion of democracy. Now, if we extend our analysis to the context of enunciation, I observe that the term democracy is systematically used as a discursive argument. So this kind of democracy argument aims to identify a political opponent, criticize his program or action rather than present a political project. So thus for each frame studied, we find criticize actors, criticize values, and values that distinguish the Rassemblement National from another political parties. And is this kind of democracy argument is also, as I will show you, ideologically structured. So the first and second examples illustrate this kind of democracy argument. Self-determination is mobilized against the other candidate in the presidential election, against also media, and in this sense, for example, the referendum become a central tool for the Rassemblement National discourse and a kind of way to promote democracy. So here citizens are identified as the founding subject of democracy, and the European Union are against the citizen, the French citizen. So the EU is just a recurring scapegoat inside the Rassemblement National discourse. So the freedom of expression frame is used by party representatives to criticize the media. And this is the example of the second quotation that illustrates an attack by Marine Le Pen against a newspaper that she believed did not respect political pluralism during an election period. So the newspaper's editors is under a professional and a private attack. So in such conception of power belonging to the people, democracy is opposed to any technocratic entity, any elite, any body that does not represent the French and that does act in the name of the general interest. So in the other hand, of course, the Rassemblement National presents itself as the voice of the French citizen and a promoter of democracy. Sometimes we also observe tensions between different frames regarding, for example, the referendum in Great Britain and in Catalonia. So indeed, while according to the Rassemblement National, the first one, so the Brexit is a form of self-determination of the British people, the second, so the Catalonian referendum, represents an opposition to the rule of law. So in both cases, the notion of democracy is mobilized to underline the positioning of the Rassemblement National. So for the Rassemblement National, democracy can only exist in a national context. So any entity superior to the French nation state is considered as anti-democratic. So in this sense, Brexit illustrates a democratic issue, and in the other hand, Catalonian referendum undermines the Spanish state, so it's considered as not democratic. So this struggle for the nation state, for the sovereignty of France, is in several respects linked to the notion of democracy, and we could therefore observe a kind of nationalist conception of democracy. As in the case in the as in the case of the Rassemblement National, for the FPE, democracy is also, first of all, an argument. Democracy refers to actor, to be fought, values to be promoted, and structuring ideologies. So the self-determination frame, the most quantitatively present one, defines democracy as power to the people. So thus the party use it to oppose the EU policies and its political opponents. So the party, so the FPE, wishes to restore power to the people by establishing direct democracy through the use of referendums. So in its rhetoric, the party created a clear dichotomy between citizens and those in power. So while politicians are corrupt and subject to economic interest, citizens must be free. And they are the majority, and in a democracy we have to listen to them. So example number 2 illustrates this opposition with the European Union. So like the Rassemblement National, the FPE also used the freedom of expression framework to oppose traditional media. In addition to this, just as I told you, unlike the Rassemblement National, the FPE also used democracy as a value that unites the community. In this case, to the frame of democracy is used against enemies, and in this case is against migrants or Islam. So these examples allows me to observe an opposition between Islam and democracy, according to the FPE, and the FPE wishes to protect Western values, including democracy, against immigration, against Islam, etc. So this kind of quotation illustrates a form of nativism. So this ideology suggests, among other things, that some individuals would be assimilable and other not. How to conclude? While democracy is kind of a Chamloon term, it remains meaningful, as we have seen through this analysis of the speech of two right-wing populist parties, the Rassemblement National in France and the FPE in Austria. So first of all, lexicometric analysis reveals that within their rhetoric, the term democracy is mobilized several times with variation in intensity according to period and audience. And I therefore observe a controlled use of the term democracy. The framing analysis show fairly similar definition of democracy for the Rassemblement National and the FPE. From a quantitative point of view, the most mobilized frames are self-determination, election, representation, and freedom of expression. So the frames of democracy vary according to the political actors, for example, a regional deputy or a deputy inside the European Parliament, or also a candidate or a party official. The frames also vary according to audience, like if it's a press conference, if it's a speeches or an intervention within the institution. So it is therefore used, the term democracy is therefore used strategically according to the context of enunciation in order to link the politician to its audience. And now, finally, the socio-ideological analysis. So our critical discourse analysis underlines that the term democracy is a political argument, but it is also not a neutral term, but an ideologically charged term. So we could use the notion of empty signifier from Laclau, for example, to analyze the term democracy in this kind of speeches. So we find some ideological component of right-wing populism inside this term of democracy, for example, identity, nationalism, nativism, etc., etc. So last things maybe I want to share with you is that in politics, words are not empty. They are ideologically loaded, and one must then understand their meaning. So I think that this kind of, we could say, identity democracy or national democracy is not necessarily an oxymoron, but rather a matter for debate to be grasped. So thank you for your attention.